Hello everyone, welcome back to those who have watched my previous chats on this subject, and a warm welcome to anybody new who might be joining for the first time. Just a quick recap. This exploration is about working with the notion, as Marconi has argued, that the world is not going through a normal transition phase, but is in fact going through a rupture. And using that as the basis then for evaluating what those implications might mean for architecture. And that would be the education, the training and education of architecture, but also the practice of architecture. In this particular talk, I want to look at what we think may well be the earliest rupture, the Neolithic rupture, and what that meant architecturally. I think we do need to be clear about the difference between transition and rupture. So we can take 5 features and compare them. We begin with pace. How long do these things take? The old transition logic is it's gradual, it's linear, it's a slow adjustment process. The new rupture reality is that it's abrupt. You don't see it coming, although the signs are there, but you actually don't see it coming until it's happened. And it is a structural break. It's a systemic break rather than a hiccup in the process. The system state, the old transition logic is that it's merely a continuity of the old order. We can continue doing what we're doing. We might have to fine-tune it a little bit, but essentially we can continue doing what we're doing. The new rupture reality is that it cannot be restored. It's broken. Humpty Dumpty has fallen off the wall. The global view is based on a cooperative global integration. That's where we are familiar with the old transition logic. The new rupture reality breaks that global integration, breaks that global cooperation, and integration is used as a weapon. T's and C's now apply to integration. Strategy, the old logic is adaptation of existing models. We'll continue. We might have to pass new legislation. We might have to change a few policies, but essentially it's business as usual. The new rupture reality is quite different. It's redesign, and it's redesign from new assumptions. I think that's probably going to be the hardest bit for us to get our heads around. The tendency is, let's tweak, let's change, let's modify, but let's essentially keep the ship going in the direction it's going. The rupture reality suggests that's not the case at all. Sentiment, nostalgia for the status quo. That would be the typical paradigm, and it's actually what we see. The talk, the buzz that you pick up in social media, I see it in the postings of architects, is, oh, it didn't used to be like this. Back in the day, we used to be able to do that. Now it's all changed, and people don't this and that and all the rest. Based on nostalgia for something that was in the past, that was a response to old conditions. The new rupture reality, again, is quite different. And Marconi makes this statement quite powerfully. Nostalgia is not a strategy. A yearning back might be a yearning back, but it's not a basis for moving forward. So if we look at these 2 columns, the old transition logic and the new rupture reality, a transition is a pleasant fiction, a term that Marconi uses, where we assume we have time to slowly tweak things like our building codes, our professional codes, and supply chains and so on. But a rupture is a harsh reality. It means the global infrastructure we rely on, tariffs, finance, materials, has been turned into a tool of coercion. In architecture, this means, amongst other things, that the old ways of sourcing and designing aren't just outdated, in many cases they're no longer possible. I have previously used the caterpillar to butterfly image as a kind of a notional description of rupture. It's a good one and a bad one, but again, for purposes of this exercise, let's just use it. The egg, phase 1, is the Epipaleolithic period, and at sites like Ain Mala, humans were still living the pleasant fiction. Essentially stationary, not as mobile as previously, but still relying on wild resources. And the architecture was an adaptation of the cave, not yet a redesign of the planet. Simply a shelter, and I'll show a bit more of that bit later on. Just simply a shelter which pretty much reflected what the cave had to offer. And then we get the economic rupture. Food and water abundance suddenly affects forager land use. A particularly nice period in the climate. So longer occupation by groups with smaller home ranges. You didn't need to travel as far to find your food because food was plentiful. A benign climate. Coupled to technological improvements. And that would be in fields like the ability to procure food through fishing, fouling techniques, bent to hunting projectiles. And we begin to see process of economic specialization underway. Being stationary in an area for longer periods of time, with not having to move as far, skills start developing around how to do different things, whether it's in fishing, whether it's fouling techniques, whether it's hunting, whether it's gathering. A degree of specialization begins. And then we get to the larva stage. This is the period of intensive consumption. This is when the caterpillar is gorging itself. The Natufian culture emerged in the Fertile Crescent, following the Bolling-Alaroid interstitial period. Plentiful, a region of dense biological productivity, literally the Garden of Eden. And suddenly, and I say suddenly, kind of in a long time frame, the old nomadic life starts to feel like a vulnerability. It starts feeling that we should stay and set up camp because we are able to feed ourselves, look after ourselves in this particular area, and there seems to be plenty. And then comes the pupa, the great rupture, the chrysalis. And at Göbekli Tepe, the old order officially dissolves. This is no longer a house. This is no longer a shelter. It now becomes a monumental statement. Suddenly something new emerges from a nomadic settler spending more time in a particular place, foraging over a shorter range, to actually setting down really hard roots and establishing a public space, a public building. Not sure what it's about. Argument seems to suggest it's both communal and religious. But again, we see specialization taking place. Someone has to figure out how to get these stones from 20-ton stones from a place to here. How do you get that done? Someone has to figure out how to start shaping these stones into quite magnificently carved elements with edges as razor sharp as you can imagine. So it requires specialized masons It requires logic, it requires skill, it requires organization. And it's no longer organization and skill just about feeding us. It's now an organization and skills about expressing ourselves. And so this is the moment where that nostalgia was no longer a strategy. Hanging on to that previous idea of foraging, roaming, coming back, and when the area is kind of depleted, you pack up and you go to the next place. All of that's gone. There's a fundamental shift in how people inhabit a space and relate to one another. And then the butterfly. Out of this emerges a constructed environment, a fundamental shift from temporary, mobile, constant movement to we are settled. We are here, we belong here, we are putting down our roots here, we are staying here. We are investing in place and we are investing in community. And then a very curious thing happens. And this is an aside, it's something I'm really interested in pursuing separately. We see the rectangular revolution. From the circular hut, the circular structures, all of a sudden the corner emerges. No more round huts. We move to modular rectangular rooms that could be expanded and repaired. There's a lot of theorizing around how this happened, what sparked that. A consistent argument is the ability to store surplus, and then the ability to cluster and the ability to expand. When you've got circular structures, it's very difficult to do those three things. They become independent elements. But when you put them together, you start sharing party walls, you start sharing roofs, and so on and so forth. Whatever those reasons may be, and I'll keep you posted on that as the evidence comes through from archaeological studies, this was a total redesign of human habitat, and it's baked into the structure itself. It is both a determinant of and the result of a social construct. This formed into a material rupture, from found materials to manufactured materials. Huge shift. Stopped using what we found, and the example there is a Paleolithic bone and skin hut dating to roughly somewhere between 15 and 20,000 years BCE, and started manufacturing artificial stone, mud brick. And the example there is the Pakistan, somewhere between 7 and 3,300 BCE. Major shift. Fire enabled some of this. So you're burning lime at 8 degrees for plaster. It's probably the high-tech energy transition of roughly 7,000 BCE. But what it signifies was the end of cheap sourcing, picking up what you could find, and essentially the beginning of industrial processing. We will now bake and make our materials. And the next rupture, the birth of property and the emergence of land use. And this particular, the birth of property rupture, changed how we use the earth. Land went from a shared territory. You moved relatively freely across the landscaping, harvesting what you wanted, whether it was materials or whether it was food. And suddenly land becomes a fixed asset. Suddenly it becomes ownership. And the architecture becomes the tool to fence in that reality. It's a really disturbing relationship between ownership and architecture. What the architecture statement does regarding assets and control of assets. And so we now start creating ecological enclaves, islands of human control in a still wild world. And this sets in motion a relationship with the earth which becomes devastating over time. Surplus becomes accumulation of wealth, and we see the emergence of the wealthy class. For the first time, wealth could be stored and inherited, whether it was the home, whether it was the food, whether it was the livestock. A tent can't hold a surplus, not that well, but a mud brick house with a cellar can, and that's what we see. And unfortunately, we then see, along with the accumulation of wealth, we see emergence of another class. We see social distinctions taking place between those who have a lot, and those who have less. And this created a harsh reality, a structural gap between those who owned the built assets and those who didn't. The bottom example is what a typical Neolithic home would have looked like. Very simple one-room structure, mostly accessible through the roof. By the time you get into early Egypt, suddenly you see a courtyard house. There's quite a different structure, and it communicates very, very different things to what the bottom structure does. This is an announcement of wealth. This is an announcement of stature in the society, and the beginning of inequity, the beginning between those who have and those who don't have. And the architecture becomes an expression of both. Carney warns about using infrastructure as coercion. Not new. The Neolithic elite did exactly that. If you own the granary and the walls, you own the people. And this is an example of 10,000-year-old tower found in Jericho. That was all about who do we keep in and who do we keep out, and what do we store here and to whom does it belong. Again, architecture becomes the primary vehicle for social stratification. And sadly, the unequal distribution of resources. You also see trade specialization, arguably the first architectural engineering construction industry. And the complexity of this new world created the first trade specialists, mostly masons, some carpentry. You needed professionals to fire the lime. You needed engineers to move the megaliths. We stopped being generalists and became a sector, one that is both a victim of these shifts and at the same time the only solution to them. What you also see is the emergence of working class workers, particularly in the construction industry, right? And a kind of a specialist person arriving. At the same time, we also see the emergence of slaves. If you needed workers and you didn't have sufficient workers, well, you simply went to go grab somebody else and you pull them in. And then that becomes a pattern, unfortunately, which we still use to this day. Carney also refers to nations developing strategic autonomy today. And essentially, Neolithic settlements did that with housing and infrastructure. Very, very strategic. How do we become self-sufficient? How do we control this domain? How do we manage our resources? And you stop relying on global flow of wild herbs and berries and seeds and grasses, and you start building your own systems for energy and food security. Unfortunately, that comes with an environmental cost. This is something that we don't get taught in architectural schools, the paradox of construction. The standard historiography of architecture treats Neolithic settlements as the foundation of civilization, the beginning of architecture, the moment humanity transcends shelter and begins to build, which is true. The record reflects that. But the point that we don't look at is the point at which material lock-in began. The Neolithic as an origin event is really, really interesting. And that word origin can apply to any number of sectors. But in terms of architecture, the rupture is not the origin of architecture as triumph, really. It is the origin of the extractive relationship with land and earth systems that has compounded over 10 million years into the planetary crisis Carney describes. What happened with the Neolithic rupture is a fundamental shift in how people prior to the rupture and after the rupture treated resources, natural resources, human resources. Prior to the rupture, groups, tribes, families supporting each other, living off the land. Post-rupture, social stratification, accumulation, wealth, slavery, domination, and also the emergence of an extractive relationship with the land and earth. The process that we are experiencing now is a direct result of that shift those millennia ago. Global Living Planet Index from 1970, baseline of 1, and you can see the extent to which the species populations have declined. That all started with the Neolithic rupture. That all started with seeing Earth systems as a resource to be exploited. And so there are very lasting impacts of that Neolithic rupture. Firstly, permanent settlement required permanent clearance. Whatever there was had to be removed in order to facilitate space for building. Architecture instantiated ownership. The home, the shelter suddenly became my home. And to cement that, you buried your dead in the floor of your unit. That made it yours. Nobody else is going to want that because there's somebody else's dead person under the floor. You stored surplus required to intensify extraction. You use building materials themselves as extractive for the extractive demands. And each subsequent rupture since the Neolithic rupture, and we will work our way systematically through them in the next couple of lectures, simply amplifies this pattern. So this means really calls for us to revisit the founding assumptions of architecture itself. The first one might sound counterintuitive, but I challenge you to reflect on it a little bit. The valorization of permanence. The industry argues very, very strongly for how buildings are lasting. Buildings are permanent. They serve these functions over centuries of time. And so despite their intensive resource use, they lend themselves to continual occupation and refurbishment. And so it holds up this idea of permanence as actually a positive value. There is a counter-argument that suggests that that is misplaced, that what you really want is maximum adaptability, maximum flexibility, ease of deconstruction and reconstruction, not this permanence that is locked in. And there's another argument to support that. US office vacancy rates across the states vary between 13 to 27%. That's unoccupied space. Japan has 9 million empty homes. There's no benefit from that. Those are resources that are locked in with no benefit. Empty homes in Portugal constitute just over 30% of their housing stock. In the US, empty homes are in excess of 15 million. And in England, in excess of 1 million. How? How can this valorization of permanence have any relevance when you look at global picture and you begin to quantify what these empty spaces across the globe represent in terms of resource? We talk about resource lock-in. That's there, locked in. The only way to get access to it is to demolish it and to start again. The second thing that happens is the building as property inscription. The moment the settlement became permanent, it raised issues of land ownership. To whom does this belong? The moment you start that debate, you start the debate about what is the commons, what is private ownership, and what is communal ownership. And then that starts reflecting over time on indigenous land relationships. And none of these things, none of them, land ownership, commons, indigenous land relationships, are external to architecture. Architecture depends on these things. Otherwise, it would not be able to be produced. And then the politics of surplus. Buildings are still primarily instruments of surplus accumulation. City after city after city looks like this. New cities look like this. In-use stock of steel and concrete, just two materials, equals 25.7 and 315 gigatons. The built environment is, in aggregate, heavier than the biosphere. That's lock-in. That is extracting and locking it in, essentially to support surplus accumulation. That's a really, really tough question to have to debate around architecture and the construction industry. So where does this leave the profession? Architecture tends to historicize itself from the Neolithic period forward as a story of progress. We hold up these structures as indicators of progress. You could probably argue that to an extent, but there's a flip side to that coin, which we don't make known. A parallel and unacknowledged history. A 10,000-year deepening of an extractive relationship with living systems of a planet now reaching its biophysical limits. You cannot have the one without the other, not under the model we have. We are in the situation because of the model we developed. And the profession that helped initiate this trajectory, the creation of permanent structure, is now being asked, not by ideology, but by physical reality, a planet reaching its biophysical limits, to think from genuinely different premises. I want to tell you that is an uncomfortable position for any discipline, that has built its identity on the "if you build it, they will come" narrative. Built its identity on "the city needs another high-rise," that narrative. Uncomfortable as it may be, it needs to be dealt with. We need to recognize the biophysical limitations. Put aside ideology. This is just hard physical reality. In this world, under those circumstances, nostalgia is no longer an option. In the next few lectures, we'll unpack, as I said earlier, subsequent ruptures, and you will see the embeddingness of these underlying commitments to permanence and technology, material consumption, the extractiveness, finding its way all the way through to the modern period and beyond. Please let me invite you to click the like button if you like this, to subscribe if you will, and or looking forward to sharing the next Rupture event with you in due course. Thank you. Take care.